guys, this is a video that's basically going to show you how I made Gray's ice swords, or his ice maker magic swords that he makes from Fairy Tale. So essentially, a few things you'll need. You're going to need some foam board. I used some dowel rods, lots of tape, masking tape, hot glue. There's some other things you'll need, but that'll get you started anyway. A ruler, like a yardstick, really was helpful to have. But essentially what I started with was the dowel rods, I believe, were 5/8 inches in diameter. And I took the sheets of foam board and cut them down to it was around 3 inches. I made lots of 3-inch strips that I stacked and taped and glued to the sides of the dowel rod. In this particular part, you'll see that I am drawing the base part of the sword, and it was shaped like a snowflake. Essentially, I cut out 1/2 of that base, duplicated it, and traced it out several times until I got that shape. Then I cut it out 4 times, so it would have, because I was making 2 swords, there would be a front side and a back side, and you can see that me doing this here. I used a very sharp X-Acto knife. Having a very sharp blade is highly important when it comes to using an X-Acto knife if you've never used one before. If you don't have one that's sharp enough, when you go to cut the foam board, it'll get caught in the blade and will not give you a nice clean cut. If you notice here, I used the ruler as a straight edge, and I cut down the side of the sword at an angle so as to come to a point in the center once I cut the second side. I used the tape, it's blue painter's tape, for extra support to help hold the ruler in place as I cut down the length of the sword. Here you can see I attached my 2 snowflake pieces to the hilt of the sword. Initially, the reason why there is a gap of space in there is I was going to use that area to put some weights to make it more of a counterbalance. However, I decided to use the weights in the pommel of the sword. The reason I made this decision was because the foam board I'd used for the blade of the sword was already heavy enough by itself, and you need some form of counterbalance to help the sword feel more natural. So essentially, I taped them in place just to get a feel for how they were going to work. Now you can see I went back to the very tip of the sword. I realized that the pieces of foam board I had were not quite long enough for the length of the blade that I wanted. I was trying to get some form of accuracy compared to his blade from the show. So I made a piece that would essentially fill out the edge of the sword. And once again, I made a template, traced and cut the template out, and glued it into place. One thing to note is I did apply heavy amounts of hot glue to any area where the foam board touched the dowel rod. I then applied just a top layer of masking tape to kind of hold it in place, just a little extra support. I then started on the second sword. I actually worked on these at the same time. The main reason why I did that is I wanted the swords to appear to be identical as much as possible, and I felt as if I did do them both at the same time, even if I learned there may have been a better way to do it from doing the first one, if I did them both at the same time, they would both look the same because I did them the same way. Also, I should just mention that anytime you're using something like an X-Acto blade, the blade can be very sharp. It will hurt if you cut yourself. It's very easy to cut yourself, so you must be careful. On the flip side of that, it is also very easy to cut yourself with a dull blade, because if you try to cut something with a dull blade, what's going to happen is you will try to force the blade to cut, essentially, and it will get caught. So it's always better to have a sharp blade versus a dull blade. So as I was talking about the sharpness of an X-Acto blade, you may have noticed that I was attempting to figure out how I was going to do the pommel for the sword. Initially, I thought I would use a piece of a pool noodle, except that was not really working for my purposes. Also, as you may have noticed, I had bought some lead weights to put in the pommel, and along with the pool noodle, it just wasn't working the way I needed it to. It's also worth noting that I used lead weights, and they have kind of a slimy-ish surface, and so that's the reason why I wrapped them in masking tape, as to give them something that I could use the hot glue to adhere them to the inside of the pommel. I also, for the hilt of the sword with the snowflake shapes that I had, I put little strips of foam board in between the areas to give it the support that it would need, so the pieces would stick together and kind of almost have like a curved shape. I also knew that I wanted to coat the sword in Mod Podge or something like gesso, and initially I thought it was going to be a good idea to coat that with paper, with layers of paper, kind of like paper mache. But I realized that for what I was trying to do, and especially in the time frame that I was trying to do it in, that was not going to be the best way to go around it. So what I wound up doing is I took the masking tape that I had and wrapped all of the edges. I actually did this for a couple of reasons. Mainly, it was to kind of protect the outside edges of the sword, but also it was to kind of give the edges a smoother finish. So I used a lot of masking tape, especially around the edges of the snowflake shape for the hilt. I had to cut several of the pieces in several sections so I could fold them around that curved shape that I had created. This actually worked out a lot better than I originally anticipated it to. So as you can see now, I'm doing this same thing to the second sword. So one of the next steps that I was going to have to do is to coat the whole sword in Mod Podge, like I had previously tried to do in an earlier stage when working on the sword. But you can't just coat it in one layer. It has to be several layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, and it takes some time for each of these layers to dry. I think I wound up doing about 6 coats for these swords apiece. I wound up using a hairdryer to kind of help it cool faster, but it took quite some time. Personally, I would have rather used several more coats than that and sand it down so it would have a smooth finish, but my time wouldn't allow it for this project. Unfortunately, one part of this that I did not get to record was whenever I spray painted the swords. I wound up spraying it with a white spray paint for like a primer coat, and then I took a gloss enamel spray paint for a sealer and also the outer coat. This was also something I had to build up in layers like the Mod Podge that I used previously. It would also be recommended that you let the layers of spray paint dry before applying the new layers, and also it's advisable to do it on a day that's not rainy. So altogether, this project probably took me somewhere between 30 and 40 hours to complete these swords. I hope that you enjoyed watching this, and if you have any specific questions about how I did any of this stuff, feel free to ask.